Hi everyone, Jake Celebrukins here. Before we get started, in case you don't make it to the end, the Ancillary Review of Books and A Meal of Thorns are free and ad-free, and we plan to keep them that way. We'd really appreciate your support. Go to patreon.com/ancillaryreview to become a supporter. $1 a month really does help. $5 a month would be great and gets you access to our Discord and monthly newsletter. Also, something I wanted to note up top. In this episode, Dan and I make some passing comparisons to Neil Gaiman's work. We recorded this shortly before the allegations of sexual assault against Gaiman came out. If you know who Gaiman is and haven't heard about that, you should probably be aware. I'll put a link in the show notes. It doesn't really have any bearing on our conversation, but I felt weird having his name in the mix right now without a quick aside. Okay, on to the episode. A critic is a creature who has views quite like a camel's. Flowers and fruit he scorns. In the flower garden of the honeyed muse, he starves unless he finds a meal of thorns. Welcome to A Meal of Thorns, a podcast from the Ancillary Review of Books. This is a critical book club where we take one particular book title and talk to writers, scholars, critics, and think about that book very deeply and how it applies to other things and what other things apply to it. Today, once again, we are joined by Dan Hartland. Dan is the reviews editor at Strange Horizons, where you can also read many of his reviews. His writing has also been published in Foundation, Vector, the Los Angeles Review of Books, and many more. Perhaps most importantly, you can read his Snap Criticism series at the Ancillary Review of Books, where Dan takes two pieces of writing, one fiction, one nonfiction, and he makes them not fight. He makes them come to strange agreements. He forces them to the negotiating table and see what comes out the other side. Dan, thanks for joining us again.
Absolute pleasure. Thanks for having me, Casella.
Yeah. So today we're going to be talking about a book that you suggested, and I'm excited to talk about, which is The Passion by Jeanette Winterson. We're going to dive into that in just a sec. But before we do, I wanted to ask, what else have you been reading? What have you been thinking about? What's good?
Yeah, so one thing I've been reading that I thought I might mention. So there's a great small press in the UK called Handheld Press.
Okay.
And they are ceasing to publish new books, unfortunately. But that does mean that there is a sale on right now, and I can recommend their back catalogue. And one of the things that I have been reading from their back catalogue is Vonda McIntyre's The Exile Waiting, which is... So Vonda McIntyre's probably best known for Dream Snake. Mm-hmm. This novel is it's a novella, really. It's in the same world as Dream Snake. So the Earth has been destroyed by some sort of nuclear conflagration. There is kind of no civilization except in one place, a kind of city called Center. Which is kind of rigidly and brutally hierarchical. Dream Snake takes place in the, if you like, the wilderness outside Center, and the main character never gets into Center. The Exile Waiting, which, is an earlier piece of writing and doesn't do everything that Dream Snake does, takes place in Center, and it's a really interesting kind of look at the hierarchy of that city. There's all sorts of things happening in it, some of which aren't completely sort of fleshed out, but it was really nice to kind of go back and read, what some people might say is juvenile, or I don't like the word, but it was great, so I enjoyed that.
Cool. No, that's very cool. Dream Snake's one of those ones that's very fruitful for those, is it a utopia or is it a dystopia, right, kind of discussions. Yeah. So
yeah, absolutely. Cool. And I think Exile Waiting has the same kind of duality. So there's obviously a spacefaring society in the world, and that kind of, again, there is an interesting kind of slippage between the two, but yeah.
Interesting. Oh, that's cool. I was just up, well, by the time this airs, it'll be a little bit in the past, but I was just up at the academic conference on Canadian science fiction in Toronto, which is very nice. But there was a great paper by, see if I can remember the presenter's name, Annie Long, I think was the name, on one of Margaret Atwood's books, The Heart Goes Last, but specifically talking about this idea of utopia and dystopia as always kind of containing each other and kind of like implicating each other, and how
Absolutely.
like focusing on that tension rather than trying to eradicate that tension is kind of a stronger writing technique. So yeah, it was very good.
yeah, really interesting.
Yeah. Yeah, what have I been reading? I just finished reading for a book club I'm doing Neil Stephenson's Cryptonomicon, which I haven't read
Oh,
in a
wow. Okay.
very long time. Which I do not want to do this at length, but it was really interesting to read that like kind of parallel with The Passion,
Uh-huh.
because it is also like on one level just a quote unquote straight. It's very straight. On another level, historical novel, but it's sort of also science fiction at the same time.
Mm-hmm.
And so that was just interesting to kind of have that in parallel here. Maybe the first time Winterson and Stephenson have been paralleled. Thus,
I think there's a lot of underexplored. Maybe we'll talk about this later, but there's a lot of underexplored links, I think, between types of book here. And Stevenson, of course, also did the Baruch cycle,
right? Yeah,
which
yeah.
is even more kind of in that bailiwick. Anyway,
Yeah. So yeah, that was an interesting pairing. And then I just finished reading and loved Lauren Vanderberg's new book coming out, State of Paradise, which I highly recommend. It's very Florida, and it's really interesting. It's brilliantly well done. I've been trying to find a way to sell this pitch. I'm gonna try it on you. So if you loved Don DeLillo's White Noise, you should definitely read this book. But more than that, if you're the kind of person who finds the idea of Don DeLillo in general or White Noise specifically annoying, then you also definitely need to read this book, because there's this weird way where it's like thematically isomorphic with it, but also feels like a rejection of it stylistically. It's really, really good. It's this, I don't know if any characters are named. It's the narrator is like maybe a metafictional version of the author, who's a ghostwriter and like trying to break out his other kinds of writing in this world where weird stuff happens, but it is relayed to you on such a spectrum of weirdness where like one end of that spectrum is just, no, this is just normally Florida. And so by the time you get to the kind of more extreme stuff, like maybe there are alternate realities sort of crossing over into this world, it's really interesting how it doesn't come across in a kind of like magical realist way where people just accept fantastic things, right, without questioning them. But nor is it on that other end where like things need to be explained or people are like reacting to them like they're totally out of mind. Yeah, it's really interesting.
that sounds right up my street. So
yeah,
I'll be checking that one out.
It's really intimate, and like very like I don't know. It's not unpretentious writing. Really, really clear, simple style that like really lands lines like kind of unexpectedly. You just kind of turn a page and just kind of get hit by this imagery or this kind of particular thing. Yeah, it's really good.
Sounds great.
Yeah, reminded me weirdly of what was the Amy Paquetka's first novel? Anyways, reminded me of that in that like embracing sort of unexpectedly emotional and like less whiz-bang sides of alternate realities and like what other lives you could have lived or how things could be different if things were slightly different. Yeah, really good. All right, should we talk about The Passion?
Yeah, let's do that.
Let's talk about The Passion. All right, so today we're talking about The Passion, which is by Jeanette Winterson. It's from 1987, originally published by Bloomsbury, and it won the John Llewellyn Rhys Prize, which I'm not going to list them all, but that is merely one award in Jeanette Winterson's giant overflowing wicker basket full of awards, because she's won like everything ever. So tell me, I want to know about your relationship with this book. I want to know why you picked this for this podcast. And maybe like kind of your relationship with Winterson more broadly.
Okay, right. So I think I picked this book largely because, so I read it for the first time as an undergraduate. I haven't really returned to it since. I remember it making a big impact at the time, and I wanted to go back to it. And so basically, I'm using this podcast as a just as an excuse to do something that I haven't already done. And I wanted to go back to it and see whether the intensity that I remember from it sort of was to do with the age or context in which I read the book, or whether it's something inherent to the text. And I also wanted to see how it had aged, because my relationship with Winterson, I've read a lot of more Winterson since. This was my first Winterson.
Okay.
And her work does separate kind of into two parts, which is the much more kind of social realist, Orange is not the only fruit, or even Why Be Happy When You Can Be Normal, which is a sort of autobiographical refiguring of Orange Is Not the Only Fruit, which was her first novel. It basically is a fictionalized version of her own childhood in a kind of northern England mill town, grown up as gay, not knowing how to express that, having a family that didn't really necessarily understand or care to understand that. And then the other half of her work is this sort of gender curious, certainly gender flipping work, where she has written SF, she has written sort of straight SF and straight fantasy. The Passion seems to me what we might once have called more of a slipstreamy novel, but actually, as I said when you were mentioning Stevenson, I do think that it, in some ways, The Passion prefigured a lot of what was to come. So I know that last time I was on this show, we spoke about the new weird. I can't. The Passion is there are elements of The Passion, right, that really prefigure the new weird. That wasn't. That was 15 years away yet. And I was really interested to talk to someone who sort of understood genre. And I talk to them about this book, because it's often spoken about in literary circles and as a quote unquote a piece of quote unquote literary fiction, which is an interesting term in and of itself. I think it's also something else.
That's fascinating. Yeah, I want to come back to that idea of this in some kind of space with New Weird. Specifically, so large sections of this book are set in Venice, which I was reading around, and apparently Winterson had never been to Venice.
Right.
Yeah. Which and those parts have this. They don't. I'm no Venetian expert, but they don't feel inaccurate to Venice. But they're also really heavy on this sort of odd, vibrant, weird kind of take on it. That's interesting. This is the first time I've read this, The Passion. I've read I don't know how many other Wintersons, but I've read quite a few. Like you, I first encountered her as an undergrad. I was in a British contemporary novel class where we read Written on the Body, which hit my 19-year-old brain like a freight train. Still to this day, one of my favorite books, one that I've come back to a lot. That novel, if people aren't familiar with, is the story of a narrator who is having a love affair with a married woman, who then, and the book is kind of split into the woman that the narrator is having an affair with becomes very sick. We're not totally sure how sick. And cuts the narrator out of their life. And we never know the narrator's gender, but it's just so gorgeously written. And I think it was like when little ducks hatch and the first thing they see they imprint on. This was like me like imprinting on like grief and love intertwined, or like what I want in a novel. The first line of that is, "Why is the measure of love loss?" And the last line of that novel is, "I don't know if this is a happy ending, but here we are, let loose in open fields." And I've been kind of chasing that high ever since. But yeah, this is my first time reading The Passion. I really enjoyed it. What were you gonna say?
I was just going to say, I relate a lot. I did not know that you'd had a similar experience reading Winterson as an undergrad as I did. And in some ways, I felt one of the reasons I wanted to go back was because I'm like, is Winterson just sort of precision tooled for that kind of reader? And having gone back, if anything, this is more intense a book than I remember. Like, it is... Again, a lot of it is the prose style. So, as you were talking about with Written on the Body, this is written like so... I want to say well, but well is just such a blah word.
Yeah.
It's very well planned. It's extremely well structured, but it does not give that impression. At times, it is quite overwhelming, and you kind of feel, is this overwritten? Is this a bit clotted? But which is strange, because the novel in the edition I have is 159 pages long.
It doesn't feel like it when you're in it, but it's a very tightly constructed novel.
I was
thinking a lot about the discourse around quote unquote MFA style writing as kind of a pejorative, for which, like, I think it is a little silly as pejorative, but I also think it has some basis in fact of a kind of a school of writing that has emphasized great sentences to the to the detriment of every other level, of structuring, which I think is something you can kind of see sometimes. But this is a book that you could, at first blush, maybe think that, because it has a lot of these sentences that are clearly just designed to just be fireworks, right? Like, it just has these lines in this. They're like, okay, you polished this and then just sent it rocketing through my skull. But that's not to the detriment of the larger structure, and it's really been thought through. So this is my first time reading it, and I didn't read a ton about it beforehand, so I just kind of dove in, and I was mildly flabbergasted by the not by the first POV jump, but after that, when it starts winding together. So we should probably tell people, in case they're not familiar, this is a book set during the Napoleonic Wars. Oh, I'm not going to get the date right, but I'm going to say like first decade of the 1800s-ish?
It is. So it's
right?
1795 through to kind of,
1805-ish, yeah, something.
Yeah.
It has two main characters. One is a kind of low-ranking soldier in Napoleon's army who works in his kitchen and delivers him chicken. And the other is a woman from Venice who winds up sort of being basically sold into sex slavery to the army. And they meet each other and during the Russian campaign decide to flee and make their chances. But so you start out kind of like super deep, just in like the muck of the army, and then you get this sudden like really abrupt shift to Venice in this very magical setting. And then you jump ahead again, and in the last third-ish of the book, there's this, it's low key, but it's kind of astonishing, the way that the narrative moves between those two viewpoints, because they're super different viewpoints. They're written very differently. They're very different people. They have very different approaches to the world. I was thinking a lot. So there's a lot going on in this book about gender, and I'm sure we're going to spend a huge chunk talking about that. But I was thinking not of these as like this is like a male viewpoint and a female viewpoint, but I was really fascinated in the back third or so how much of it is about people's worldviews just kind of not lining up in ways they can't really communicate to each other.
Absolutely.
And it really feels like, what if you throw two different stories together and they don't blend, but just kind of weirdly pass through each other? Like like when like galaxies move through each other, and like occasionally a star hits a star, and that's a big deal. But most of the time, they just kind of pass through. Yeah, the structure on this is wonderful.
It is, and like from and it there are a lot of turns in the structure or in the plot, such as it is. But all of them are seeded. None of them are. All of them come as a surprise on a first read, I think. But all of them are basically seeded on the first few pages in very clever ways that when you're first reading it, just read fine and you just sail over them and go, yeah, okay. And then when you go back, you realize, oh, yeah, from the off, she was telling us what was going on here. But I completely agree about the two viewpoints. And the key to the book, I think, is how it deals with those opposing viewpoints. I think you're right that just because Henri, the soldier, is presents as male, and I mean Villanelle, the Venetian, is a much more complicated sort of figure in terms of her gender, because she a big part of the novel is spent with her sort of cross-dressing as a living, as she refers to it,
right?
And we shouldn't see them as male and female necessarily points of view. But effectively, Henri starts the novel believing in the march of history, in the Napoleonic march towards progress. So Napoleon tells them, look, if you just come with me, guys, I'll conquer the whole of Europe and everything will be great. Liberty, equality, fraternity, let's do it. And Henri completely buys this. And he has a passion for Napoleon. Right? From the off, we're told, not sure about this, because you mentioned that Henri serves Napoleon chicken every single night, regardless of how hungry the rest of his army is. And I think the rapaciousness of Napoleon's consumption of that chicken is meant, I think, to key us to everything's not right here. But nevertheless, he thinks that life is a straight line. And many people around him tell him, the past is gone. The future you can't control. All there is the present. Just keep marching. And it's a very... At one point, he talks about he's afraid of the dark because he likes to see where he's going. Because he's going only in one direction and he wants to see, right? Villanelle's whole worldview is completely different. So Venice, as you say, is this kind of magical city. It's not inaccurate to Venice, but it's this magically presented city where every alleyway is a dead end and you'll never go the same way twice to the same destination.
Yep.
Villanelle she says, oh, well, you know, like back in the day, we started our days at night because night is when we were rocking. Night's what we like in Venice. So, and she's very conscious of the presence of her ancestors and the building of their future. Yeah. So she exists in time and space in a completely different way to Henri.
Yeah.
And then the novel says, you know what? How on earth are we going to bring these people together? Because bring them together, it does. But I agree. Like, I don't think it ever lets those worldviews touch.
Yeah.
It bring them into harmony. It doesn't do that.
Or just kind of barely, just at the edges.
Right.
And I think the ending of the novel with Henri just kind of in this institution on this island that Villanelle could break him out of, right? And he doesn't. It is a really really strange, poignant on Villanelle with this very like sort of cosmopolitan, I think, idea that it takes all kinds. Like, you know, we can find a way for this for our lives to get together somehow. And the impossibility of that as this sort of weird lingering thing hanging over it's really interesting. I was wondering, reading this, so I've been thinking a lot about war novels and anti-war novels. And such a huge chunk of this, particularly on Henri's part, is just feels like a fairly traditional war/anti-war, you know, war is hell novel. And I was wondering, and this is purely just for my own satisfaction, how much did you learn, like, in primary school about the Napoleonic Wars? I'm just very curious.
Nothing.
Me neither. Like, the most I learned about it was, like, the Louisiana Purchase, you know, which, like, Napoleon needed some cash, and that's why we have, you know, the stuff on the other side of the Mississippi. Like, that's it.
It is a strange thing. So, as listeners will be able to tell from my voice, I'm British. I'm English. So you would imagine that Battle of Waterloo, all of that stuff, Battle of Trafalgar, we get taught it a lot. We don't. We don't. And I think partly it's because it's quite a complicated history. Not all of it, you know, Britain was not straightforwardly, has never been straightforwardly, but the Napoleonic War was particularly difficult to straightforwardly depict us as the good guys, although Britain does its best as presenting sort of Napoleon as a straight ahead dictator. Right. So we just don't. We didn't get taught it a lot. Yeah. I learned everything I know about the Napoleonic Wars from Bernard Cornwell's Sharpe novels.
Okay.
I would like to think that Winterson knows that. I would like to think that she does set the novel in a period which is both complicated and under known, and deliberately lives in those gaps.
So I was really fascinated by, so we haven't touched on too much yet. So there are fantastic elements to this novel, like fairly extreme ones. Not just, well, not extreme is not the right word, but they're not just kind of flavor. They're not just like someone has a vision of some fairies or something, right? It's like, no, like there are things here going on that are magical. And so when I started encountering those, that kind of threw me into a headspace, and this is maybe I have a too generically focused approach to reading, but it started making me wonder about, okay, well, where are the bounds on the historical versus fantastic elements here? And I started sort of scrolling along and reading as I was reading the book of checking these like dates and places, what was going on in the war, and finding like, oh, actually all the war stuff here, like very, like 100% lines up. Yeah. With, I do want to call out one thing, which is this is short Napoleon propaganda, which most modern historians are in agreement that he was of average height. He was 5'6" or 5'7". This is mostly British propaganda. So I want to share that with our audience. But yeah, because this has these strong magical elements, it made me wonder about the rest of the sort of deep realism of it, and like the I don't want to call it a quasi romance. I don't know what to call the main relationship. They are in love, but in very different ways. With each other. But so like that sort of not quite meshing, there's this really interesting kind of like not quite meshing of the realism and the fantastic elements here.
100%. So much to say. So yeah, the genre stuff I think is just really interesting here. So you're absolutely right. It starts and Henri is just talking about I think it's like late 1790s, and Napoleon is preparing his army for an invasion of Britain, which never happens. And all of it is totally. I mean, obviously the details of it are fictionalized, but the reality of it is entirely accurate. They then don't invade Britain and they go off and fight at Austerlitz. Again, completely what happened. Then they decide to invade Russia. They have the Long March east. It's an absolute nightmare for the French army. All true. And between these bits, you get this Venetian stuff.
Yeah.
Which is increasingly wild. So when you first arrive in Venice, there are little bits like, so the first hint that this is not your granddad's historical novel is that the boatmen, so the gondoliers in Venice, are reputed to have webbed feet. Now, when this is first mentioned, it's kind of mentioned as, oh yeah, that's the legend. That's the legend. Yeah, that's what people say. Then when we flash back to Villanelle's birth, she has webbed feet.
Right.
She has webbed feet, and she later shows her webbed feet to others. And that's the first hint. Hold on, what's going on here? And you might be able to, if you're a certain type of respectable literary fiction reader, rationalize that. Okay, maybe that happens. That's okay.
There are people with webbed feet. Yeah, like that.
Exactly,
yeah, right.
Exactly. So then the novel draws you further on until at about page 114. Henri enters a house, steals a heart in a jar, brings it back to Villanelle, and she gulps it down because it's her heart, and she needs it back. And literally, he listens to her gulp it down from a jar, and it's in the jar beating.
Yep.
And at that point, you're like, okay, this is the new weird.
Right.
There are other examples. So, for example, Villanelle visits routinely a creature, a woman that she calls the Exile, who was, we think, a former very wealthy Venetian who's fallen on hard times because, of course, Venice is invaded by Napoleon II. And now she lives in a hole in the wall, and she's like slime green and can prophesy things. Now, in a
living on like seaweed that she scoops out of the canals, and
right. Now, in a straight fantasy novel, we would know exactly how to read all of this stuff. We would know that the boatmen were like, a separate sort of amphibious race, and we would know that the Exile was that. Was a creature, and we would know that the heart in a jar was, literal. But in this novel, you're absolutely right. You kind of get sideswiped by this stuff, and it's really great because Henri at one point just says this. So Villanelle says, look, you've got to go into that house and you've got to get my heart because I was once in love with a married woman and she took my heart and I haven't had it since. And she's told him this story all the way down from Russia to Venice. She stole my heart. She's kept my heart. But when she says, go into that house, my heart is in a jar, go and find it and bring it me back. He was like, wait, we were talking figuratively, weren't we? He says it.
Yep.
And she was like, no.
Yep. And part of what I love about the setup with that is that, so like Villanelle is, she is distinct in a lot of ways from other Venetians, but her relationship to the fantastic is not, right? It just happens to be sort of concentrated in her personal history. But she's not like some one-off magical character. It's this sense that like the rules operate a little differently here, and she's just representative of that. It's also kind of fascinating, the relationship, as you mentioned, that she has with the past and the present and the future in a very different way. I found that particularly interesting because it inverts a little bit the more traditional fantasy trope of like the rural farming connected to the land, which is Henri right down the line, right? Like he is to some extent like hold this idea of this sort of, bucolic pastoral life that he could in theory return to at some point as sort of like what he's fighting for and what he might wind back up at again at some point. And that, feels like every, bumpkin knocked up to fantasy protagonist that you
he's
kinda
Luke
get.
Skywalker.
He's Luke
right?
Skywalker. He's
Yeah.
Frodo. He's thinking of back home on the farm. But he is the one who's sort of like subjected to these world historical forces that are sort of shaking everything on the shelf until it comes off. And Villanelle, with the webbed feet and the magic and the gender that's maybe less fixed than Henri is used to, she's the one who is situated in a community, in a history, in a past, who is certain that she has like both ghosts behind her and descendants ahead of her, in this anchored way in the city that is very different than traditional fantasy, and I think lines up with this like weird resonance that we're tracking down.
I think that's spot on. And I think what I really like about this novel is that until this point, Winterson had been best known for Orange is Not the Only Fruit, which, as I've said, is about someone growing up being rejected by their culture and society and family. In this novel, Villanelle is not rejected.
Yeah.
In Venice, it's fine. The rules work, as you say, work differently. At one point, she has a stepfather. Her father was a boatman, and he disappeared in mysterious circumstances. She gets a stepfather who's a baker, and he's like, yeah, go for it. Go and work at the casino, do whatever you like. It's grand. And it's such a nice touch.
It's such a nice touch. I just wanted to second you, because it's something that like, it would be so easy to overdo and make it kind of maudlin, but it's just like in this historical novel, you just have this completely believable set of parents who are like, yeah, sometimes women dress like men instead. Sometimes they have web feet and walk on water and do things like it's a thing. Sometimes people do. And that's fine.
Yeah. And she, Winterson, kind of wrung foots you several times in that way. So, for instance, when the woman that Villanelle falls in love with and steals her heart, literally, first meets Villanelle is in a boy's costume in the casino. And Villanelle agonizes when she's invited to the woman's palazzo while her husband's away. Agonizes, she's, in a very sort of Shakespearean kind of as you like it way. She's going to discover my secret identity. What's going to happen? And there's all sorts of hijinks where she tries to avoid taking off certain parts of her clothes. And at one point she thinks, well, I guess I could show her my knees. And but then the woman says, I know you're a woman. What are you doing? And it's just great.
It's great. And there's even the other layer on that, which it's set up this, I'm having an affair, we need to keep it hidden from my like wealthy scholar husband, right? And you're like, who's probably a jerk and not satisfying her, right? And then you get this, like, no, they're very happily married, and they just have this kind of relationship where he goes and does his thing for months or years at a stretch. And yeah, it's this, and it's funny, I don't want listeners to think that this is some kind of cozy novel or something, because it is horrific for long stretches of war crimes and starvation and sexual abuse and all kind of stuff. But it has these moments of utterly believable sort of like, I don't know, mundane niceness and acceptability, and just these flashes of pleasure and acceptance throughout it. They're just so nice.
Of hope, right?
Yeah.
Because I think one of the things that the novel is trying to do, especially even with its genre play as well as its gender play, is to say, look, something else is possible. So it deliberately, I think, puts together historical war fiction in which you're absolutely right, awful things happen, awful things are done, with this kind of fantastical romance kind of fiction. And I mean romance in the sort of generic way, and says, look, and deliberately kind of puts them side by side to say, well, which one do you want? Which one do you choose? They're not compatible.
Yeah.
But they are both options. And I think that the way in which the novel kind of starts in a very straightforward, army getting together, this is a Napoleonic novel, and then slowly leads us towards new weirdness, I think is significant. I think it's trying to teach us something. Now, whether or not all of that is fully thought through. I often think that Winterson isn't necessarily... She's not a logical writer in the sense that that's not true. She's a very we've already said she's well-structured and thought-through writer, but her novels are governed first and foremost by feel.
Yeah.
And I think that's an important element to the effect that she has that we both experienced when we first read her. So I think that's important to remember even when we're saying, she's doing all this kind of sociological stuff.
Doing it by feel, like I'm trying to find like a good way to say that, because it's not like, again, this is not that bad stereotype of MFA writing where it's just one beautiful sentence and one beautiful feeling after another, but that, and part of this is, I don't have a final thought on this, but so this book is called The Passion, and at several different points it offers slightly differing definitions of what passion is. But to go back to this idea of it being structured and logical, but not really plotty, I think maybe the way I could say this is that Winterson has her characters pursuing not action and not sort of like paths through historical time or events, but pursuing feelings, not like objects of affection, but like, what is this thing that I am trying to sort of get to the core of, right? And like Henri, like realizing that this thing that he's trying to get to at the core of initially is illusory or rotten, connected to this giant, horrific, inauthentic imperial dream. And Villanelle having different things at different stages of the novel, but always sort of trying to get to this core of this thing that she's feeling. And that's what motivates it. Yeah, an inner motion, not a plot motion.
Because the kind of rationality of the myth of progress, which is what Napoleon is selling, and what the British Whigs were selling at exactly the same time, is false. It seems very rational and logical, and that sense that Henri has when he starts the novel, that you start from one place and you go forward and you get to the end. Venice completely confounds all of that.
Right.
It's not... The rationality is fine, but it's a lie. And what is... I think we both noted that towards the end of the novel that, there's a great quote, isn't there? Yeah, the cities of the interior are vast.
Yep.
And do not lie on any map, right?
Yeah.
And there's a distrust of cartography, there's a distrust of, any sense of kind of trying to map or sketch or whatever, anything. And that, you're absolutely right, that sense that they are chasing feelings, and feelings are by their nature ineffable, is important to the novel.
And that, I don't want to draw this metaphor too large, but that memory itself, personality itself, identity itself are things that are real and they are in the world, but they are different every time you come back to them. And that doesn't match up with the idea of a Napoleonic campaign, right? Where everything is on the map and you know ahead of time what's going to happen, and it'll be the same when you go through there again. And the way that Venice works, and it's minor, it's not made like a huge magical realist deal of, but even this idea that like you just can't take the same path twice, it's going to be different. And that, she hints at these inner parts of the city where there are people who are living in this almost Mieville-ish other city that kind of moves around and shifts, and they're also exiles from all these other cultures that are there. That seems to be part of what, it seems like it's part of what the novel is trying to get the reader to figure out, and more concretely in the book, it's what it seems like Henri should figure out, and doesn't quite.
He doesn't. Instead, he chooses, as you say, at the end of the novel, to stay in an insane asylum on an island in the lagoon, away from everyone and everything and all those complications. And indeed tells the whole novel from the perspective of the asylum.
Yeah.
So it's not a contemporaneous account. He is writing the novel, his part of the novel, in the asylum. And again, if we go back to this idea, as you say, of everything being, all of the rationality and the history and everything being sort of questionable. Putting one of your main, questioning the sanity of one of your main characters is one way to do that.
Yeah.
And I think that Although, on the other hand, he's only in the asylum because he's lied to the authorities about a crime he committed on Villanelle's behalf.
Right.
So he's not actually insane.
Mm-hmm.
It's just that society at large has decided he is.
Right. And I mean, it works out better for him, right? Because he doesn't wind up being punished as severely as he would have been. And it without like, there are certainly elements of this that I think lend themselves to a sort of post-traumatic stress reading of Henri all the way through, right? Which is obviously not, in the time period this is set, is not something that would have been known about much. And I don't know to what extent this was like sort of popularly discussed in the 80s, but was at least known at that point. But so much is this kind of like reasonably sweet country bumpkin who has just gone through like a meat grinder of war crimes, came out reasonably okay, fell in love with someone who couldn't quite replicate it, return it in the same way, and is just in this odd place. But it's still not. It's not a terrible ending for him. It's still vaguely right. He's gardening, he's writing. His rejection of Villanelle feels very strange, and I have had a hard time sort of wrapping my head around that. Maybe more than that. So Villanelle basically has the ability to get him out, and he turns it down repeatedly. And I've been wondering about that, pondering that a lot. And is that a rejection of the kind of freedom and fluidity more than it's a rejection of Villanelle specifically? That there's something sort of too daunting, too scaring about the actual freedom outside in this sort of, I don't know, existential kind of sense. It's too much for him.
I think so. So I think you're right to say that Henri doesn't get the whole distance. He ends the novel a lot further along than, and here I'm using his own language of a single road that you travel down.
Yeah, right.
He's abandoned a limited viewpoint.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think he's embraced the full extent of viewpoints that he might be able to were he to let himself.
Right.
I think that's right. But also I think it's an ambiguous ending, right? We can see it from Henri's perspective, or we can condemn him. Mm-hmm. We can see it from Villanelle's perspective, or we can condemn her. Mm-hmm. And what was that final line from Riding the Body? Something about, I don't know whether this is a happy ending, but...
Yeah. Here we are let loose in open fields, yeah.
And it's the same. And what I also love about it is... Because this novel, we talked a lot about genre, and it is a fantasy. It's also a kind of fairy tale. Mm-hmm. There's a very sort of, when Henri goes into the house to find the heart, he goes through like 7 or 8 rooms to find the heart. And there's a very self-conscious sort of set of, and in the first room there was a harpsichord, and then in the second room there was this, and then there was a tapestry, and all of these sort of self-consciously, almost ersatzly, allegoric things.
Yep.
And it is a fairy tale. And the ending inverts the usual fairy tale beginning, which is that the Henri is in the tower.
The prince is
that's
up the tower.
The prince is in the tower. Mm-hmm. And Villanelle is outside saying, "I can rescue you. Come out."
Mm-hmm. Oh, that's interesting.
Yeah.
Those motions in the book where it does go into this kind of fairy tale-ish or fantasy kind of element, but they're so balanced. They don't feel like a color filter has dropped over the screen and suddenly you're in fantasy. So no, like we're the same place where like 20 pages earlier, 50 pages earlier, we were learning about the footwear of the French infantry and how it is ill-suited to marching through the mud on the way to to Moscow. Like it's the same world, and it's so well done. And I wonder, I don't know, I always think about generic reception, and this is the first time that this book has ever crossed my radar in the context of genre fiction, and it's just fascinating to think about that. I was oddly enough, I was thinking a little bit about Neil Gaiman's writing at some points in this, but there's so many little bits in this about just how well Winterson can nail these iconic fable-like images within the context of something that you've bought into as real. That's really, really good.
And in some ways, this novel is really embedded in 1980s postmodern English literature. It reads side by side with, and by English I mean written in England rather than in the English language.
The Anglosphere, yeah.
Yeah, it sits right next to Julian Barnes, who was the husband of Pat Kavanagh, And Pat Kavanagh was the literary agent of Jeanette Winterson at the time, who's thanked in the acknowledgements. So there is a real link there. And Winterson and Kavanagh did have an affair. It sits next to Martin Amis. It sits next to Salman Rushdie, who, of course, was living in London at this time.
Right.
So in that sense, it's really embedded in this period. And I was thinking about, there is a great sort of review of the 1980s British fiction, edited by Emily Horton, Philip Chew, and Lee Wilson.
Okay.
And they argue that all of these writers were rejecting Thatcherism and neoliberalism, but simultaneously all competing with each other.
Okay, yeah.
In that very kind of neoliberal way where, we're going to get that prize. We're going to write the best sentence. And in some ways, the novel is completely embedded in that. You can read this alongside Barnes's History of the World in 10.5 chapters, and they talk to each other.
Okay.
But I think it was also a really unusual novel at the time, and probably more far-sighted than any of the others in its generic play.
That's interesting.
I think that it gets something that is going to happen pretty soon. Like you say, in the 90s, you get Gaiman, you get Jeff Noon,
right?
And then you get Steph Swainston and the New Weird. And I think The Passion gets that.
Interesting. That's really interesting. That idea of like prize competitiveness, I think that does actually open up a little bit of some of the rating here, and like we've talked about, like being on the edge of overwritten, right? Or this MFA.
Absolutely.
Yeah. I will say, so there were two things in this that suspended my suspension of disbelief, which one was the really obvious proof rock lift. There's a bit where I think it's in Henri's section. I'm not positive, but we're just like out of the blue. It's just like, till human voices wake us and we drown. And I'm like, that is not
that's
something
not yours.
organically that a French infantryman in 1803 is going to be. And the other thing, and I don't know what to think of this. This is just sort of my bugbear. There are a couple places in the novel where people do speak in French, and I'm like, what is happening here? Because aren't they speaking in French all the time? It's an odd little thing, and I could see why she did it where she did it, but I don't know, it threw me. It really threw me. That's a thing I have an issue with. I have like a fascination with how in literature and in film, how we present when we are quote unquote hearing another language.
I can explain that if I feel minded to, and I agree. This explanation may just be sort of glossing over just an error or a glitch. Winterson wants you not to trust the novel. So we keep getting told one of Henri's. There are lots of catchphrases in this novel. Vianel's is you play, you win, you play. So you win, you lose, you win, you lose, you play. Right. So and Henri's is I'm telling you stories. Trust me. Right.
Yeah. Yep.
Now, if someone tells me to trust them that often, I'm gonna trust them less.
Yeah.
And I think that it's possibly like what she's doing when she says, and suddenly they speak French. She wants you to think, hold on
interesting.
a minute. Aren't they speaking French all the time? Like,
right.
What is this? It points at the artificiality of the whole thing, which is part of her, I think, project.
That recurring I'm telling you stories, trust me, is like a little precious, but I also love it. Especially with the ambiguity of like, I'm telling you stories, like idiomatically that can mean I'm lying, right? But it doesn't have to.
That's right.
So it can just be like, no, like it could mean I'm telling you the truth. It could mean, hey, like, you know that I'm engaged in this project of telling a story. Trust me for the purpose of following the story. And it kind of has all three levels in it every time it comes up.
It does. And lots of people in the novel tell stories. So Henri's own mother loves the Bible, very, very devout Catholic, tells Bible stories all the time. One of Henri's friends, he makes two friends in the army. Spoilers, both of them die.
Yeah.
One of them is Patrick, who's a kind of defrocked Irish priest, and they say it's a great character. And he, at one point, they say of him, he was always seeing things, and it didn't matter how or what. It mattered that he saw, and that he told us stories. Stories were all we had.
Yep.
And it's like idiomatically, story can mean lie. Fiction is a lie, right? But it's not just a lie.
Right.
And I think leading us down those kind of Venetian-like kind of alleyways where we get lost, again, is part of what the novel is trying to do.
There's also something really interesting about the character binary, that Henri is engaged in in the project of telling a story, right? And sort of like constructing a thing, writing a thing that we get. And that's not really what Villanelle is doing in the same way. She's doing something different. She's talking just as much, and I would say maybe more organically in some ways, but she's not engaged in the same kind of construction, although she's constructing other things, which I think that's a good transition point. But let's take a quick break, and then we'll come back and we need to talk about that a little bit.
Sounds good.
All right, we are back. We are still talking with Dan Hartland about The Passion by Jeanette Winterson. Covered a lot of the novel. One thing I want to talk about, and I don't know what I want to say yet, I'm going to find out as I say it, is gender and sexuality in the novel, which is a big part of it. It takes a little while, I think, until you hit that. It's not really until you meet Villanelle that you start seeing this as like a major theme of the novel. But she is, the novel says she cross-dresses. She is what we would now call bisexual or pansexual, don't know, and plays around a lot with her identity. And then once Henri enters the scene, I think there's some stuff going on there too. This is obviously a theme that Winterson has explored across lots of her work. But yeah, what are your thoughts on what's going on with gender presentation in this novel? I know that's a very broad question.
It's tricky.
Mm-hmm.
So we've spoken mostly so far quite admiringly about the novel, and all the things it does and all of the tensions it holds in like kind of a remarkable balance. And I think that it's trying to do the same with gender, and I'm not sure that has aged as well as the rest of the novel's treatment of its themes. So you're right, it doesn't really land on a kind of identification of particularly Villanelle's, because as you say, most of the gender stuff is focused on Villanelle. Identity, right? So Villanelle seems, you mentioned earlier, she is constructing things other than realities for us to live in. So Henri is constructing a reality that he wants to convince us of, especially at first. Napoleon is doing the same, so on and so forth. Villanelle isn't interested in that. She's just saying, look, this is who I am. I'm going to tell you all about me. Suit yourself. That's her kind of vibe.
Right.
But I think even she, she seems, you mentioned that Henri at the end of the novel, or I mentioned, I think you said this, that like the freedom that Henri could have, it kind of scares him off, so he stays on an island. I think in order to present that quote-unquote freedom, the novel deliberately doesn't kind of collapse Villanelle's wave form. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I kind of see what you're saying there, of not giving us a definitive place that she winds up, or some like sort of heroic summation of her identity that she can deliver to us and then triumphantly stride off into the Venetian sunset. No, it leaves it more open-ended.
Yeah.
But there is, I don't know, there were tons of parts in this in how Villanelle talks about herself and her sexuality and her gender presentation. There were tons of points that I was just like, oh, interesting. Like, that's cool. Didn't quite see this coming. Maybe should have, from this author. But there were also points where, like, nothing hyper major, but there were a bunch of points where I was like on the edge of a yikes. is the way I would put it, of not aging super great. There's one line in particular of talking about women in Venice and says that something to the effect of like they're all kinds of women and not all of them are women. It was just kind of like, oh, like, and I know this is the character, not Winterson saying this, but even so, it's just kind of like, that's a weird way to say that. And there's this odd kind of like, there's a lot of gender play, but I'm not sure what the characters are doing, and I'm not sure what Winterson is doing with it beyond kind of playing with it.
I think that's right. At one point towards the very end of the novel, Villanelle just says, yeah, I don't dress up anymore.
Yeah.
She just says, I don't do it anymore. Well, what was that? What was that then?
Mm-hmm.
And it's not for Villanelle to tell us one way or the other, right? But the novel doesn't seem to have a sense either.
Mm-hmm. And I mean, to a certain extent, it's it goes along with this sort of like more fluid. I don't want to say more progressive, but this idea of Venice as a more expansive, less fully categorized kind of place and culture, right? Where Villanelle can kind of play around with these things. Yeah, I kept kind of wanting it to do a little more. It's not that it totally collapses Villanelle back to some sort of traditional feminine, but I mean, it does wind up sort of focused on her as a mother. I don't know. It's very weird. The bit about her her villainous husband, who we later find out connects the two threads. Also, again, like this is totally fine, like to just use as a character, but I was like, like you can tell he's evil because he's fat and he likes little boys, and he wants his wife to dress as a little boy, and I'm like, oh, that's just like. I've already compared Winterson to Stevenson, and that was weird. Like, don't make me bring Baron Harkonnen in this and make me compare Winterson to Herbert, because that's weird. That stream is way too far off. I don't know. There's just, I don't know what to say about it. It's something that nagged at me through the book, and that's maybe a bad word choice, but like, it's just something that just was there enough for me to be interested in and kind of catch me perpetually. And it easily could have gone in the direction of sort of being a historically realist account of a sort of like, I don't want to say ahead of her time, but it's sort of like a kind of liberated spirit sort of railing against the gender confines, right? It could have easily done that, but that's not what it does.
It is absolutely not that. Yeah. I wonder whether we need to embed again the novel in its sort of 1980s context, where Winterson is being both praised and dismissed as a quote-unquote lesbian writer.
Oh, yeah, that makes sense.
And a lot of the reviews and criticism of her at the time were very focused on this idea of the lesbian writer. There's a famous, I don't know whether it's famous, there's an essay from about 1995 in Prospect magazine, which is kind of a centrist thing, and they're like, oh well, she's taken a dip recently, so this is a few years after the Passion. She's taken a dip, her fortunes and reputation have taken a dip. Maybe it's because she needs to write more about motherhood and other elements of other elements of the quote-unquote female experience. And I just wonder whether the Passion was like an attempt to say, no, just stop this. We can be freer than this. And that freedom, we're saying, oh well, yeah, but isn't it a bit amorphous? Isn't it a bit kind of difficult to sort of pin down, make granular? The novel really does not want to be granular, and I think that's because she felt pinned down at the time. I know in books since, so for instance, Frankenstein is like a 2019 novel where Winterson kind of puts together, you mentioned earlier in Snap Criticism, I put books together and make them work. And she puts together Frankenstein and The Winter's Tale and sort of tries to make them work. One of the narrators of that novel is trans. In fact, the protagonist of the contemporary timeline in the novel is trans. So it's not as if Winterson isn't aware and hasn't become aware and hasn't developed her thinking over time. I just wonder whether this novel was deliberately not giving that. That's not to say that it's okay.
Right. That's interesting. I have Frankenstein on my radar. I would mention that the reviews of that were thoroughly mixed as to the success of the portrayal, or
I was not wild about the novel.
Yeah. But this is obviously something Winterson is interested in. I think this sort of like, not necessarily wanting to be post-label. I don't want to say that's what particularly she's looking for, but this wanting to play around and find a different space, not wanting to collapse things down to binaries. I mean, that's one of the things that like, I still think Written on the Body is a gorgeous novel, and I would recommend it. I think its central, I don't want to say gimmick, its central gambit of having a narrator whose gender you don't know is something that I don't know how well that actually works, because it only works by sort of ignoring the fact that people do in fact perceive your gender and sexuality, and I don't think that that aspect of the novel works less well, although I think the novel as a whole still works really well. I was thinking about this. So Villanelle is the character, like I said, feels a little more organic in some ways, and like and you come to this book with preconceptions. So who knows? If I hadn't known who'd written this, maybe I wouldn't have read it the same way. But as soon as we got into Villanelle, I'm like, oh, here we go. Here's the real character.
This is the Winterson novel.
Yeah,
right?
I'm like, oh, okay, affair with a married woman. I'm getting the sense of your passion, like for real. And it's really clicking. It's great. And Henri's interesting because he doesn't feel very boyish. He doesn't feel very manly, and I don't want to, you know what I mean? Like, I'm trying to figure out how to say this, but like he is that half of the equation here, but he just feels sort of unformed in a lot of ways, and then he's plunked down in this Napoleon context that, you know, he works in the kitchen, and he doesn't like, soldiering doesn't become his identity or anything like that. And then before he is too formed by that, he wisely flees it. He just feels interesting to me gender-wise, and he is in love with Villanelle, or at least so he thinks. He also just feels massively younger than her, and I don't know what their actual ages. I don't know what their ages are. I don't think they're that different, but he just feels, bumpkin-y, has a different kind of passion, and maybe a sort of a different kind of more pure idealization or something of what love is. But it doesn't feel like we're contrasting these two viewpoints. It's more like Villanelle has charted this kind of space that it feels like it would be good for Henri to go into, and he doesn't, or maybe he can't.
Well, but what makes I think the novel interesting is that he could. So you mentioned like early on in our discussion that it wasn't right, and I think you were correct to say this. It's not right to say that the two viewpoints in the novel are male and female. Mm-hmm. And a large part of that is because neither character fit into those sort of roles. Mm-hmm. If the novel would have been a very different novel if Henri had been a sort of flashman figure, right?
Yeah,
so
right.
A soldier who loved soldiering,
mm-hmm.
and like was really into it and totally sold
mm-hmm.
on the whole thing. He's not. He is winnable
mm-hmm.
by either side, and so the male figure in the novel is Bonaparte,
mm-hmm.
right?
Yeah, right.
Henri is torn, or not even torn. He sort of just floats mm-hmm. between Bonaparte and Venice,
right?
And he could. It's really easy to see because Villanelle is so, as you say, organic and engaging, and thinking about remembering the novel as I have since I read it the first time. It's Villanelle sections that I remember.
Right.
I as I read the novel, I realised, oh yeah, I remember that bit. Henri's less so, mm-hmm. and that's because it's a very magnetic performance
mm-hmm.
by Winterson, the Villanelle sections. So it's really easy to overlook that Henri is actually like also very. We've talked about freedom and flexibility. He drifts. He does. Perhaps he does it less. Perhaps he moves with less purpose and clarity mm-hmm. than Villanelle, but he moves. Mm-hmm. And his identity is also not fixed.
Right. And he's been knocked out of two different kind of grand narratives, right? Like sort of the grand narrative of just sort of like village life, and then the grand narrative of like being a part of the army and this vision of progress in Europe. And he's sort of swept up by it. And then when he's knocked out of it, it's just kind of, I don't know, this odd tragic figure, and he's full of longing, and he wants to commit to things. Yeah, it's a weird contrast.
It is, and I do think it comes back to like the novel's sort of interest in. The novel is not ambivalent. It's way too sort of vivacious for that.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, it's sort of interested in ambiguity to some extent, but kind of without any of the sort of pejorative that can attach itself to that word.
Yeah, there's a couple different points where I think Villanelle describes kind of the fundamental binary as not men and women, but soldiers and women. You know, in they're talking in the context of like, you know, Napoleon's camp, and I think about that because she's kind of rejecting both of those a little bit. You know, it's not hyper clear what she means by woman, but she's not following the very traditional, even by Venetian standards, lifestyle, and like soldier is never even remotely an attractive category, right, for anyone here. So it makes sense to reject that. So yeah, there's this kind of like glimmers of a maybe not post-gender, but some sort of more like liberatory, less fixed definition here.
I would entirely agree, which is why I wish when the novel says, yeah, there are two types of people, there are soldiers and there are women, I wish in a way it had found another word, because the soldier role is the quote-unquote traditional male role, right? So it would have been nice to find a way of expressing the quote-unquote traditional women's role. But the sleight of hand that the novel, it's not even a sleight of hand, what the novel is trying to achieve is to reject the default.
Yeah.
And in this world, in Henri's world, in the Napoleonic army, the default is male. So get rid of that word and call you soldiers, because that's what you are.
Yeah.
And everyone else is a woman. And I can see Winnison being hee when she did that, right?
Right. Yeah.
But nevertheless, I agree. It sets up quite an odd binary that the rest of the novel doesn't really fulfill.
But again, that goes back to like this underexplored complexity or ambiguity on Henri's part, right? Of like, if you have rejected being a soldier, and soldier was your de facto gender, right? Then like, what are you now?
Exactly. Yeah. And we never quite get there. And maybe that's what we're both kind of stumbling towards. Yeah.
Yeah. Huh. Well, I feel like we could say a lot more about this novel. I have been a thread that this novel is sort of stitching into my personal interest and discourse is just thinking about speculative genre's relation to historical fiction and vice versa. Again, at the conference I was just at in Toronto, there was someone gave a paper. I believe it was Wendy Roy was talking about Cherie, Dimaline, and a couple other writers, and had this idea that basically taking this idea that like historical fiction is always speculative fiction, and sort of like maybe we should apply some of the techniques we use for both to the other and think about them a little more. And that's just something that kind of fascinates me. It's funny thinking about it in terms of this novel, because on the one hand, this is not a historical novel in the sense of like, if your dad's really into the Napoleonic Wars, get him The Passion by Jeanette Winterson. You know, like, it's not exactly that kind of novel, but it's also really faithful. And like, even though we're talking about all the stuff that sort of fascinates us more, this has long stretches of kind of like grueling realism, right? Of like what it's like on the trail and in the camps and all the surrounding infrastructure of the war.
There are few better descriptions of the French invasion of Russia, the War of 1812, particularly of the reality of what that meant for the common soldier. It's great.
So I did not study the Napoleonic Wars at all in public school, but we obsessively studied the American Civil War, and so I read like so many accounts of the sort of horror of it. And that's only 30, 40 years before this or whatever. That stuff just really clicked. It's really working. But to get back to that idea of like the speculative and the historical in this relation, it's made me think about a thing I really like about, weirdly enough, William Gibson's career trajectory, is this idea of, science fiction, quote unquote, predicts the future. That's this one sort of like really facile way to think about it, that we all reject and we all get past. But it is kind of one thing to do. It's like, what's it going to be like? And if you look at Gibson's novels, they start really far in the future and then they get closer to the present timeline until he writes pattern recognition, which, spoiler, we're going to talk about on the show later. which is set slightly in the past, right? It's set like a year or two before the pulp, right? Because he's writing it right around the time. And what I think is fascinating about that, and he's talked about this idea that predicting the future is obviously a silly role for fiction when the actual real world is so complex that it gets harder and harder and harder to describe it as it is now. So he's talked about like predicting the past is what you're doing. You're trying to put together enough clues that you can make a coherent version of what's already happened, but it's still kind of a guess. And that's kind of what history is, and that's definitely what historical fiction is. And it just makes me think about what that's doing here. Yeah, great novel.
Yeah.
Maybe get it for your relative who's super into the Napoleonic Wars. See what happens. It's really good.
I'd be fascinated.
Yeah.
I'd be fascinated to know. Yeah.
I want to wrap this up before I completely melt in this very warm closet. Dan, what else do you have going on? What are you excited about? What do you want to share with people? And where can they find you?
So I have. By the time this comes out, I'm not sure where we will be. But I have a piece forthcoming in the Los Angeles Review of Books about Christopher Priest.
Oh, great! Wonderful.
And I'm hoping that will be out when this comes, when this is published, or around that time. And it circles some of the same questions we've asked today. What is genre? Because Christopher Priest's last novel, Earthside, I would contend, is not science fiction. If it is very marginally so.
Okay.
And it's so interesting to ask why Priest did that. So there you go.
Fantastic. At the Los Angeles Review of Books, we will get that in the show notes if it is out by the time this comes out, which probably will be. Awesome. That's very exciting. Thanks again so much for joining us. Yeah, we'll have you back. Any final Winterson thoughts?
No, just go and read some Winterson.
Yeah,
go and read this book. I think it is full of stuff that anyone. I hope what we've shown is that this novel has a lot in it for such a small novel, for such a slight in terms of page count. And I think a lot of readers will get a lot of different things from it, which is a great recommendation for any book.
And we've talked a little bit about the nature of the writing here, but I just need to emphasize again, just many of my notes in the margins of this book were just like underlining something and just saying like banger, like just like like Winterson knows a thing or two about how to write a sentence that just floors you without being overwrought. Just really great. Cool. Thanks so much, Dan. We will talk again soon.
Looking forward to it. Thanks, Cassell.
A Meal of Thorns is a podcast from the Ancillary Review of Books, an online magazine founded to address the radical possibilities of criticism, with a focus on speculative fiction, world literature, and utopian impulses. Go to ancillaryreviewofbooks.org for regular reviews, essays, interviews, and more. Our opening poem is by Bartrahari, translated by John Bruff. Our music is by Giselle Gabrielle Garcia. Our artwork is by Rob Patterson at The Ratio Farm. If you'd like to support the podcast and the Ancillary Review of Books, that is rad. A few different ways you can do that. Subscribe to our Patreon at patreon.com/ancillary review. That would be super cool of you. We really want to get the ARB to a point where we can pay our contributors. Check out our show notes for bookshop links. If you buy a book through there, we get a cut. The internet, as you know, is a dying hellscape, stalked by mindless algorithms. Do your part to resist, or at least be a little more mindful. Click like, click share, leave a comment or review wherever you find us. Tell someone you know to check us out. It really helps. Questions, suggestions, pedantic notes about things we got wrong? Drop us an email at mealofthorns@gmail.com. Next time, Amal El-Motar is on the pod to talk about The Trader Barrow Cormorant, realistic fantasies, anti-imperialism, and extremely online discussions of fictional lesbians. To everyone out there on some side of the back-to-school equation, you have my envy and my pity. Hope you still have some time to read. Oh, I'm going to blank on the name. I'll edit this out later. Oh, well. What's the name of that?